Bonjour tout le monde! Welcome back to We in France. I'm Diane. And as you know, French culture is known for its elegance, its delicious food, its rich history, but some of the customs and habits that are commonplace in France, they might come across as rude or even off-putting to Americans. Now, these cultural differences, they can cause misunderstandings, lead to conflicts between the two groups, and I want to get into it. So let's talk about French habits, very normal ones, that might be considered rude in the United States. All right, so I recently did a video that you all seem to enjoy about a bunch of American habits that would be considered rude by the French. So in the name of balance and all, I'm back today with the reverse video, what French habits might be considered rude in the United States. So we're gonna get right into it with number 1, casually debating at dinner. Now, what French people might consider friendly debate or lively dinner conversation might come across majorly rude to people in the United States. French people, they're happy to bring up more heated dinner topics like politics and just debate their points with the people around the table. And friends, they argue with each other, maybe even throw a few colorful jabs, they raise their voices and that sort of thing. It can get really lively in France. But the difference is then by dessert, everyone's moved on, the debate stays at the table, and it's all in good fun. It's a bit of a national sport for the French and definitely part of the French way. Now, remember, debating is not fighting to the French, and it's certainly not personal. French people really, they don't get upset or have any hard feelings because it's normal to discuss things in this manner for the French. And you get a little fired up in the moment, but then it's over and done with, and everyone's laughing again. There's no grudges. Now, in the US, I'd recommend treading with caution if you try this, and be ready for some hurt feelings and people who definitely take this lively French debate style personally. Many dinner conversations that I've had in France, they would never fly in the US or be considered polite ways to interact. Americans might take serious offense. Okay, number 2, keeping a social distance from people that we don't personally know very well. And this is something I've discussed quite a bit on my channel, how the French separate social interactions into personal and public spheres, keeping their distance socially with people they don't know. And that means that the French are respecting the other person's personal sphere. It boils down to the fact that strangers, they won't be overly friendly or personable with people they don't know as a way to not intrude. Now, in professional contexts, people like cashiers, pharmacists, employees you run into, they're not going to make small talk at the cash register or ask a perfect stranger, hey, I love your shoes, where'd you buy them? Or to say, hey, what's up? How's it going? What are you doing later today? As a way to make conversation. That just really doesn't happen in France between people who don't know each other. And on the receiving end, I'm speaking from personal experience, this can feel cold. This can feel really unfriendly to Americans, as if the French person is not interested in us at all. We just seem to have more of a casual and friendly style of communication in the US. I personally found this style of communication a bit rude and standoffish, definitely cold, until I was able to wrap my head around the nuances of how the French interact socially. They're polite but reserved, and that's done out of respect for you. Number 3, directness. Now, another habit that can be seen as rude by Americans is that the French tend to speak their mind bluntly, a bit more directly and without filters. In France, directness is valued and it's seen as a sign of honesty and also authenticity. But Americans can interpret this as rudeness, as insensitivity, and we tend to value others' feelings and diplomacy in communication. And in general, I'd say the French are less afraid to share their criticism in all contexts, and this can feel rude and hurtful if you aren't used to being on the receiving end of it. I've really even heard French people say things, well, I'm just being honest, it's the truth. And yes, of course, it might be the truth, but Americans might find that to be unkind and rude, and at the very least, it would lack tact, and that's definitely not something you want to be doing. Read the room. All right, number 4, not tipping at restaurants. Now, if you're not aware, in the United States, it's customary to tip 20% at restaurants, but not in France. In France, French people do sometimes tip, but it's not something everyone does always across the board, and it's never 20% at a restaurant. And that's partly because French waiters earn a salary. They don't depend on tips to live. And in general, maybe it's a good thing, tipping is not as widespread in France as it is seemingly everywhere in the US. And because of that, French people don't realize that when they travel abroad to the US, that they need to tip 20%, regardless of how great the meal was, regardless of if it was a fancy meal or something more casual. And that's because they're not used to tipping at home. But in the US, it's expected. And if you're not going to leave a tip at a restaurant, that would be considered rude, but it happens all the time. I know servers here, maybe when they deal with French people, other Europeans, they can weigh in on if that's been the case. In your experience as a server, waitress, bartender, do French people tip you in the US? All right, number 5, the sound in conversation. Now, when you interact with the French, this is definitely a sound you're going to hear in regular conversation. I'll call it the sound, and it definitely caught me off guard the first couple of years I was in France. It's a conversational sound that's kind of used in the, there I go with in the way that is used in English. Like if you're talking to someone on the phone, you're in conversation, it affirms what's being said. You know, you say, and it lets the other person know that you're listening to what they're saying, you know, that you're still there, that you haven't hung up the phone. And just to describe this, I'm going to play an audio clip that I recorded with my French husband, Tom, just so you know what I'm talking about here before I continue. And yes, I've exaggerated the sound for emphasis, but listen.
Ouais, est-ce que tu as regardé le match hier? C'était super. Il y a eu plein de buts et puis maintenant ils vont être en finale, ça va être génial. J'espère que tu vas regarder avec moi parce que franchement c'était cool.
Okay, but unlike the in English, the it always sounds like it's a bit of an interruption and rushed. And it always seems, for me at least, to come across abruptly. And maybe it's used more frequently than a would be every 10 or 20 seconds. And I found it so abrupt that I thought people were always rushing me to stop talking. And I'm like, they keep going, And I'm like, oh gosh, what am I doing wrong? You know, but I realized that that's not what they were doing. This is a normal French sound that lets you know the person you're talking to is actually listening. And it's a major communication difference. I have a blog post as well with audio of all these French sounds that I'll link below if you want to know more. They're cool. All right, number 6, a negative slant to speech. Now, if you speak French, you definitely know what I'm talking about here. Just to give you some examples, when you want to say something is pretty good, you'd say it's pas mal, which is literally not bad, which means you like it. So how's that cake taste over there that your mother took all day to make? Oh, pas mal. Is that guy good looking? Well, he's pas moche, not ugly. And this stands in sharp contrast to what you'll hear in the US. I feel like Americans, maybe other English speakers, we like to say everything's amazing or great or the best ever. It has more of a positive slant, maybe over the top, depending on the person, but it leans in a more exuberant, positive direction than in France, hearing more of a glass half empty kind of thing. It's definitely a change. And you know, even if you didn't like the cake that your mom put a ton of effort into making, most Americans would probably default on the side of saying, oh, it's good or great or pretty good, you know, even if they didn't love it, because that's the polite thing to say. If you replied with a, not bad, that would definitely be considered a bit rude, I feel, in English, at least in American English, but not to the French. And a personal note, my in-laws always get a kick out of it and smile a bit when I tell them how great their food is, but I'm not lying. I've never said, oh, it's not bad. That's one French trait I have not picked up on. I keep saying things are great because they are. And here's another example of this negative slant. When the French mean maybe, you ask a question if they can help you with something. Instead of getting a maybe, you'll almost always get a no, a non, or ce n'est pas possible first before you have to kind of finesse your way into a yes. And this can be exhausting and come across as like overly negative, especially when you're dealing with the bureaucracy, customer service, really anything. You ask for what you think is something simple, and then you're told no, only to ask 4 more times in 4 different ways, and then you kind of work your way to a yes. And I feel like it can seem like a waste of time, a waste of effort if you're not used to it, just to be told no, ce n'est pas possible, when it would have just been easier to say yes from the start. It's almost like a little game you have to get used to, but that's just how it's done. All right, number 7, not picking up after your dog. Now, let me preface this by saying the French love their pets just like Americans. Vet care is fantastic here, and plenty of French people pick up their dog's poop. They do, okay? Let me say that right out of the gate here. They even sell waste bags in France. A lot of parks have the dispensers that give them out for free. Overall, in the time I've lived in France, it's a little over a decade now, streets and parks, they've definitely gotten a lot cleaner over the years. There is progress being made on that front, and that is most certainly a good thing. But, and yes, there's a but. The French stereotype of there being a lot of dog poop all over the sidewalks, it does come from somewhere. It's not just something someone made up. There's still loads of French people who never pick up after their dogs, especially if the dog does his or her business in the grass, you know, not in direct, in a direct walking path on the sidewalk. And every time I go out in my neighborhood to walk, I will absolutely see, even on a 10-minute walk, that there is poop that has not been picked up. And yeah, of course, there are some Americans that are just as careless. But it seems like if you don't pick up your poop, your dog's poop rather, in the US, people will shame you. The default thing is to pick it up. And I haven't really seen that in France, people being shamed by other French people. And to Americans, it's super rude to leave your dog's poop on the sidewalk or the grass, just waiting to be stepped in. Yuck. All right, and now for some very important context. I try to keep my intro short here, but there are some things I want to cover. So first, as I always say, cultural habits and the ways other countries do things, they're not inherently good or bad or right and wrong. The French aren't always right, Americans aren't always wrong, vice versa. No, and I just want to say that this video and the reverse one I did of the American things the French find rude, it's not meant to put anyone on the defensive or to shame any culture. We'll find rude people all over the world. It is certainly not nationality specific. I also think it's important to point out that no one tries to be rude. No one goes out of their way to say, I'm going to be a rude a-hole today, but of course we can all have bad days. And even more importantly, French people doing the things I just talked about, they're not deliberate efforts to be disrespectful or offend Americans when they're in the US. They're acting appropriately in their culture in France, but cultural norms don't always translate. And if we don't know, we don't know. And look, when we travel, we can act however we want. You do you. But I think it's important to be aware of how our own cultural norms from our home country can be perceived abroad, and then make the changes we feel are appropriate. And no, not every French person does these things, nor does every American find them rude. There's always a lot of nuance, and that counts for a lot. So let that be said. Also, I think when we talk about cultural differences and norms abroad and all that, it's important to remember that we see the world through our own lens. And that was created by our life experience up till now, how we grew up, our socioeconomic status, our social class, our home culture, what we do for work, everything. And I think it's so important as we move through life and travel and continue to meet people from all over the world that we step back and we try to see things as different and use that lens of a different culture as a way to understand and not place judgment upon something we deem as rude by casting a snap judgment, but by further allowing ourselves to learn about the norms in other countries and see how things are done. And that way we can adapt our own behavior to be a better traveler, to be better received, and overall have a better experience. So that's my point of view. That's where I come from on this channel. To that end, for any non-French folks watching, if you plan on traveling to France soon and you'd like a bunch of tips to help you prepare for that upcoming trip, I have an e-guide. It's just a few bucks. I'd love for you to check it out below. It's titled 75 Beginner France Tips for a Standout Trip. And I cover tips for dining out, transport, money, and all that good stuff that tourists are going to want to know to be prepared. As always, I'll leave it there for today. Thank you for being here. Thank you for subscribing to my channel and interacting with me down in the comments. I feel like I shouldn't even say this, but I just want to say, if you choose to leave a comment, please be respectful. And if you can't be kind, be quiet. See you back here on We in France soon. Salut.